Good afternoon. My name is Maggie Hartley, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Engagement here at the National World War II Museum. Thank you for joining us for this evening's program commemorating Hispanic Heritage Month. Today's program is entitled A Place of Our Own, Mexican-American Veterans in the Post-War Southwest, with Dr. Laura Key, the Managing Editor of the Journal of Arizona History with the Arizona Historical Society. So without further ado, I will now turn the program over to Laura to share more about the experience of Mexican-American veterans when they returned home from the war.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I first want to say I am incredibly honored to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And this, the World War II Museum holds a special place in my heart that I'll let you know about here. Give you more details in just a second. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully everything is okay. Right, and hey, hopefully that's everybody can see that. And hey, there we go. I love when technology works. So first, again, thank you for joining me. Greetings from Tucson, Arizona, where it's a beautiful 84 degrees finally. So I first want to tell you, when I interview historians, I ask, how did you get involved in this kind of research? Because it takes years and years of research. So I'm going to start off with kind of like a family story. I come from a large Mexican-American family who valued oral tradition, and I had three uncles who served in World War II. And I grew up hearing about their stories and hearing about the abject poverty that they grew up in. And then when Pearl Harbor was attacked, they immediately joined. And I grew up just wanting to know everything I could about their lives and about their service. And my uncle Manuel was on the first wave of Omaha Beach and was injured. My uncle Joe, which you see here in the picture, flew in a B-25 and was shot down over Italy and rescued. And my other uncle Louis was fought on Guadalcanal in the Philippines. And I just thought they were the coolest things ever, and I wanted to learn everything about them. This is my uncle Joe in his, I call it the Humphrey Bogart pose. And the reason why the World War II Museum is so special to my heart is that we had plans of going. He was so proud to show off his support and to support me that I know he's looking down and he's very pleased. Unfortunately, we never got to make the trip, but this is definitely on his list. The article that you see on the left there was an article from the Las Vegas newspaper back in 1945 announcing my three uncles coming back home. Mexican-American families like mine often had several family members serving in the military. And the newspaper did a short story on my grandparents and my uncles returning after the war, two of them wounded and the third being released after the war. Next to my Uncle Joe here is my Aunt Molly, who worked at the basic magnesium plant, kind of a Rosie the Riveter in Henderson, Nevada. So I got the best of both worlds and got to hear about the home front and in the military. So a little bit about Mexican Americans and their service. Approximately 400,000 Mexican Americans served in World War II. We don't have an exact number because they didn't specify as Mexican. They were categorized as white. So we kind of have to look at surnames and parents of birth, country of birth of their parents on census records, but it's between 400 and 500,000. A majority of these Mexican Americans served in frontline combat positions. They did not earn defense job deferments or anything like that because they were mostly working manual labor jobs before the war. Hundreds of thousands more women and men worked on the home front to support in everything that they could do. And tied with that, Mexican Americans played a vital role in the U.S.-Mexico border. Just like today, the border was a spot of understanding or wanting to protect it at the same time as using that border as a wartime asset. And Mexican Americans were crucial in that. Mexican Americans were also very keen on proving their patriotism. If you take a look at this poster by Leon Hoguera for the Office of War Information in 1943, Americans all, we fight for victory. And Mexican Americans were very eager to prove their patriotism. Sometimes they weren't always accepted as US citizens, and that they were guest workers or guest people in the country. And also the border with Mexico was was part of contention because of World War I, and was Mexico going to be on the United States side at the beginning of the war? So Mexican Americans took on this idea that no, Mexico is an ally, and we as Mexican Americans are going to fight right alongside every other American. So if we take a look at these Spanish language newspapers, this gives us a good idea. This is the El Tuxinense from Tucson here, obviously announcing, declaring war against Japan. But towards the left there, Mexico breaks relations with Japan. We have a next one here. This is the El Continental from El Paso. Numerous countries declare war, and then right below that, Mexico breaks relations with Japan. And then a third one, La Opinion, is from Los Angeles. Again, Japan declaring war on the United States, or United States declaring war. Mexico breaks relations with Japan. All of these Spanish language newspapers, and many more like it, were eager to prove that Mexico was an ally, and that Mexican Americans were going to be part of the people that make things in the war, and that we're going to be able to join in the fight and in the home front.
Hey, Laura,
why is this?
Quick.
Yes.
You're in presenter mode instead of actually screen sharing.
Oh, it says screen sharing.
Mm-hmm. So
well,
we just
see,
yeah. So we're gonna need you to reshare it because it was showing what you're seeing, not the full screen share.
Let's see. Let me try. That's weird. How about now? Because it's saying share.
Yeah.
That it?
That's it. Thank you. And apologies to the audience. We just wanted to make sure you guys were able to see everything.
I'm so sorry. Everything looked the same on my computer. I'll go back because now I have to, right? I'll go really quickly though. This is my Uncle Joe, and that's my Aunt Molly, the newspaper article, Mexican American servicemen and women. This is the Americans All poster. And this is front page of El Tuxinense from Tucson, El Continental from El Paso, and La Opinion from Los Angeles. So, well, now you can all see it. I apologize that you couldn't see it before. So why this just need to prove their patriotism? Because Mexican Americans weren't always treated as US citizens. During the repatriation, you can see on the left here, or during the Great Depression, there was repatriation, meaning making Mexican and Mexican Americans go back to Mexico, even if they were US citizens or had been here for their whole lives. They were repatriated to Mexico. We often think of segregation between Black and white Americans, but in reality, in the Southwest, in Texas, in Los Angeles, here in Arizona, they were also segregated from public schools, pools, entertainment, public spaces. So Mexican Americans took on this. We are going to prove to you that we are Americans. And one of the major ways they did this was Mexican Americans in combat. We talked about, almost 400, 500,000 serving in the military. They were not officially segregated because they were classified as white. But the draft boards, and sometimes when the Mexican Americans would volunteer, they would stay within their own neighborhood or barrios. And really good example of this is Company E, 141st Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry Division, was originally a National Guard unit, and it was federalized in 1940 in Camp Bowie, Brownwood, Texas. And Mexican Americans recruited from the barrios of South Texas, including a large population of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. They were deployed in North Africa in April 1943. They fought under General Mark Clark and actually spearheaded the Allied invasion at Salerno. So this was an all Mexican American unit for the most part. Another examples from Arizona is the 158th Infantry, nicknamed the Bushmasters. They were actually organized before Arizona was a state in 1865, primarily for the Apache Wars. Members comprised during the 1940s of Mexican Americans and indigenous peoples, mainly here in Arizona. They were ordered to federal service in 1940, and they were deployed to Panama for military training, but also for security reasons. In January 1942, and that's where they adopted their nickname, the Bushmasters, for a highly venomous snake that was found there. They were sent to New Guinea in May 1944, and they were part of the occupying force in the Pacific. General MacArthur said of the Bushmasters, no greater fighting combat team has ever deployed to battle. They fought valiantly, and they earned many distinguished medals for their service. I just like these pictures. This is their patch with the Bushmaster snake. It wasn't just in the military. Mexican Americans on the home front organized in their community to support the war with blood drives, war bond rallies, scrap drives, victory gardens, held USO dances, just like other Anglo-Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans. But Mexican Americans were also used to organizing within themselves, within their barrios, within their community, because they had been ostracized in the Anglo world. So there were several groups that I'll get to more as we go on the presentation that organized and either changed their focus during the war, or they created them specifically for the war. And these new home front associations, besides supporting the war, will evolve after the war to almost like civil rights organizations, but at a very local level. The first one that I'm going to talk about is the Alianza Hispano-Americana. They were founded in Tucson in 1894 originally as a mutualista, which is a mutual benefit society where they gave death benefits or loans during the Depression. Men and women belonged to Alianza, and they were critical in community building. And they started in Tucson, but lodges spread across the Southwest. And their main headquarters was actually here in Tucson, but each lodge had their own little leadership thing where they would organize within their community. And during World War II, almost immediately they switched to home front activities. And a lot of it was making sure that everybody knew that Mexican Americans were going to fight for the United States, that they were citizens, and that Mexico was an ally. If you look on the left-hand side, this is a cover of their monthly newsletter, and you can see the two soldiers, American on the left and Mexico on the right, holding or shaking hands over the border of the V for victory, Alianza por la Victoria. And covers like this and iconography was common for Alianza during this period. They also held huge war bond drives. And in fact, after the war, they had purchased more war bond drives than any other similar sized organization, over $170,000 worth of war bonds. And this Victory Tamal is an example where they would make these, they would have the women of Alianza make all of these tamales, and for every war bond that you bought, that you got a tamale. A big hit down here in the Southwest. Another group that I am really partial to is La Asociación Hispano-Americana de Madres y Esposas, and they were founded in Tucson in 1943, specifically for the war. They were organized by middle-class Spanish-American men, but it was the women who ran the organization. They were so successful with war bond drives, and they created a newsletter in English and in Spanish, Chatter and Chismes, to send overseas to the soldiers and to tell them everything that was going on here in Tucson. But they held huge war bond drives. And in fact, in 1944, the Army Air Corps dedicated a B-25 Mitchell bomber in memory of Private Bernardino Estrada, who was the first Mexican-American killed from Tucson. The association raised over $180,000 worth of bonds, and you can see a picture here of the Spirit of Tucson that appeared in El Tuxanense, which is the Spanish language newspaper here in Tucson. Rosa Rodriguez was the founder and secretary, and she was the one that created the newsletter and just instrumental in making the association work. Now more nationally, so these Mexican Americans who served in huge numbers, they come home and they look to join veterans organizations, just like many other veterans across the United States when the war ended. They didn't always feel welcome in these existing Anglo clubs or organizations, so they started to look to organize on their own, specifically with American Legion posts and Veterans of Foreign War posts. But also, new organizations were established, often focusing on civil rights. And probably the most well-known one and the best example is the American GI Forum, organized by Dr. Hector Garcia, who was a World War II veteran. He was a captain at first and then major. And he was a doctor, and he came from Corpus Christi, Texas. The American GI Forum, founded in 1948, and it was initially to help veterans gain the medical benefits that they earned in the war. But after he was looking around and he was looking at the huge need for veterans, he thought maybe that the GI Forum could go a little step further and maybe get with education and help with civil rights. And then the Longoria affair kind of changed their mission. Private Felix Longoria, there on the left, was killed in 1945 in the Philippines. His body was returned to Three Rivers, Texas in 1949, and his wife Beatrix went to the local funeral home to have a service at the chapel and to be buried. And the owner of the chapel wouldn't let Beatrix bury Felix there because he was Mexican and, quote, whites wouldn't like it very much. Beatrix, obviously extremely upset, contacted Dr. Hector Garcia, who had been making, his presence known in South Texas. And Garcia contacted then Senator Lyndon Johnson. And after a few telegrams and letters and phone calls, Johnson made arrangements for Longoria to be buried at the Arlington National Cemetery and have a military funeral that you can see on the right-hand side, and Felix's grave on the left at Arlington. So the Longoria affair really changed Garcia and other members of the GI Forum that, yes, they wanted to help the veterans and they wanted to get their benefits and their GI Bill and everything, but also that there was so much more work to do because the segregation and prejudice was still present, even though after the war. And these veterans came home, they were really no longer willing to put up with what they had put up with before, with the limited education opportunities or the segregation and the prejudice, and that, if they served alongside Anglos, in which they did in all capacities of the war, that they learned how to organize. They learned how to use bureaucracy. They learned who to go to, and they learned what to demand. And that the war really was this kind of watershed moment for these veterans in that they really started organizing within their communities. The GI Forum was really small at first in Corpus Christi, but as their reputation grew and their membership grew with more veterans coming home, the GI Forum is actually still with us today and a major force in voting rights and with, still with segregation and border issues. It is a huge Mexican-American organization, and it really comes from these veterans in World War II coming home, deciding that they were most well equipped to help change things. On a more local level, I study Arizona for the most part. It's a good thing I work at the Arizona Historical Society, but it's just fascinating because Arizona sometimes gets overlooked in this when we talk about Mexican Americans and border and military. And Phoenix is a huge city, and Tucson much smaller. But it's also only 90 miles from the border. So, and we have a really strong history of Spanish and Mexican history. So I look at Arizona, but I think this kind of fits all over the Southwest, of that these little agencies, little organizations start being formed after the war because these veterans come home and they are used to organizing and they are used to following orders and they are used to doing things their way to get things done. And one of the best examples of this is the Tony F. Souza and Ray Martinez Thunderbird Post 41 of the American Legion. And this is located in Phoenix, Arizona. It was established in October of 1945, initially as an all-American post. And Ray Martinez, who really was the leader of the first post commander and the leader of the post, was a veteran himself, and at first when he went to the American Legion, the Legionnaires didn't want him to open an all Mexican American post because, quote, they're going to open up a beer club and have fights and gambling. And Martinez says, this is exactly why we need a post, because there's these stereotypes and this prejudice, and that we need to organize with ourselves. All right. And Martinez, wrote to the local paper and, to the newsletter. When we got out of the service, some of us knew we had a mission because we were not going to go back to the discrimination we had suffered before. We knew that this was the time right after the war, and this was the time to make the move. And that's almost exactly what they did afterwards. And one of the very first things that they kind of sunk their teeth in activism was the Tempe Beach, like a swimming pool in Tempe, Arizona, which is like a suburb of Phoenix. At the beach, there were signs, no dogs and Mexicans allowed, which were common across the Southwest. Pools were only open to Mexican Americans and African Americans the day that the pool, or the day before the pool was supposed to be drained to clean. LULAC, which was an organization that predated the war, had challenged segregation of Tempe Beach, and actually, the federal court said that it was unconstitutional, but the Tempe Beach committee said, yeah, well, we're not going to listen to them, and it remained segregated. Local Mexican-American citizens in the barrio of Tempe approached Post 41 members for help. They were the ones who'd come back. They were the ones who wore the military uniform. They had fought for their country, and they kind of became the leaders of that community that many Mexican Americans looked up to. There wasn't a lot of role models then, right? There was just a lot of poverty, and people didn't have a lot of representation. So these veterans, these Mexican American veterans, kind of became those leaders for the community. And Post 41 organized their members, met with committee members, Tempe Committee. They met with Arizona State College, which is ASU, Arizona State University today. Other Mexican Americans in surrounding neighborhoods. They met with the Tempe Chamber of Commerce. They got people elected to the board. And after, I could go on for hours on this, but after some legal fights and some conference fights, the No Mexicans policy was abandoned, kind of, right? They still, the post members still had to go so that the actual signs were taken out and that Mexicans could actually use the pool. But this was a really good example of how the military services, that cohesiveness, that training, that camaraderie, right, came back from the Pacific and Europe to exact change in their own communities and for their own people. And obviously African Americans had their own civil rights movement, and a lot of the times they did not work together. In California, they did a little bit. Texas and Arizona, they were two completely separate movements. So because segregation was different for each of those, right? But what does stay the same, we hear about, the double V campaign for African Americans, a victory over there and victory over here against segregation. The same thing kind of happened here, but at a more local level, because segregation was not codified like it was for Black Americans. It was based on language or skin color or class, right? And not everyone segregated Mexican Americans, right? So it was a little bit different for that. I'm going to look at another example, one that's really close to me, is the Cosio Estrada American Legion Post 59. And this one is right here in Tucson, Arizona. It was established in May 1946. It's located in Barrio Hollywood, a historic Mexican-American part of town, still with us today. If any of you all get out here, some of the best Mexican food you'll ever have. They are still active. They are still active today, and they're, like many American Legion posts and VFWs, their memberships are getting older and trying to adapt to this new world. But they're so important. They were established in 1947. They were named for Willie Cosio, a Marine corporal who was wounded in Saipan in June of 1944, and he later succumbed to his wounds. And then Bernardino Estrada was the same one for that plane that we had talked about. He was killed in New Guinea in December of 1942. And so the founders and Cosio was one of them, his brother, founded this American Legion post for kind of the same reasons as in Phoenix. They wanted to organize among themselves. They were more comfortable with them. They wanted to help within their own community. That's why they were at first they were in El Rio, which is another Mexican community, and then moved to Barrio Hollywood. Because they wanted to help their own community. And I'm not even talking about like Tucson or Tempe, right? They wanted to help their Mexican barrios that they had grown up in, right? That they could help their specific region, help with baby checks, Christmas parties. They would hold one every year for children that wouldn't get any gifts from Santa because their parents couldn't afford any. So very direct helping for the people in their own neighborhood. The post was organized just by 22 veterans, and it grew exponentially as as 46 and 47, and by the 1950s was a very large post and held a lot of fiestas. They held a lot of fundraisers that tied their Mexican culture into their American service in the war and for their community. And it became a central piece in this Mexican-American community. They sponsored basketball teams to help with juveniles, Mexican-American kids that didn't have after-school programs. So they provided a basketball team so that kids could, help and enjoy sports and get them off of the street, right? They would help serve the disabled, distressed, widowed, and orphaned. They actually put it in their charter. That was their main mission. And juvenile outreach also made it into their mission later on, that we can see from the well baby checkups and the basketball teams. But they also were instrumental in challenging segregation, not to the extent as we see as the American Legion Post in Phoenix. And that has to do with region. You would think Arizona is Arizona, right? But up in Phoenix, or in northern or central Arizona, segregation was much more stringent than here in southern Arizona and Tucson. And it's a really long story of why that happens, but it has to do with the historical place that Tucson had in the Spanish Empire, New Spain, and with when Mexico owned this nation, and the middle class and elite Mexican Americans, businesses, and cross-border trading and relations with Anglo officials. So segregation wasn't as stringent here. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen or that there wasn't discrimination or prejudice, but it was lesser than it was in other places like Texas or in Los Angeles, was especially segregated. We don't think of California, right, as that. We think of it as a Southern thing, but it was absolutely for Mexican Americans and Black Americans and Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans, that neighborhoods were strictly segregated. So the Cosio Estrada American Legion Post was definitely more on community building. What's also interesting about this, you can see the photos here of the post being opened. But on the right, the women that I told you about that raised all the money for the plane, they donated money to Post 59 and to become an auxiliary unit, because obviously after the war, they didn't need to sell war bonds and they didn't need to do the Chatter newsletter, but they still wanted to help their community and they wanted to help the veterans. So they were like, this is perfect. And they actually gave the money to help start up the post so that they could carry out their mission, and they remain the auxiliary for their lifetime. And today the post also has an auxiliary that can trace its roots back to these women. So they're like one of my favorite. Next. We go back to Allianza, the ones that we talked about that, kind of made the border okay, and that worked to highlight Mexican Americans' contributions to the war on the home front and in the military. The post-war was a boom for this organization. Veterans and their families joined even before the war ended because they had made such a name for themselves in the community for doing these home front activities. So their membership boomed, and men and women came to Allianza to be part of something bigger, right? The war had changed them also, that, they worked on the home front. Not many of their leaders served in the military because of age, right? So they worked on the home front, but the war had changed them also. They were like, hey, we did all of this work. We proved our patriotism. We proved that we were loyal and dutiful Americans, and we need to use our expertise, everything that we learned in the war, we need to use it for post-war. And they began to focus more on equality. More on challenging segregation, especially in Phoenix area, suburbs of Phoenix, Glendale, and Folsom, to challenge that segregation of classrooms and schools specifically. Also to create community programs, to, much like the American Legion posts, right? To create these community programs so that Mexican Americans had a place to go, had a place for someone to read a book in Spanish, to learn English, to learn Spanish, because many second and third generation, myself included, did not grow up learning Spanish because our parents or our grandparents were punished for speaking Spanish in schools. So we never learned how to speak Spanish. So Allianza took on this bilingualism kind of before it was popular in the 1960s and 1970s, that everybody should be bilingual, especially if you live this close to the border. For business, still today, right, here in Southern Arizona, bilingualism is prized for just everything, for people living in the United States and for the border, cross-border trading and culture. So with a lot of their community programs, they inserted their Spanish and Mexican culture into it because they felt Mexico was an ally. We had proved that we were allies, so it's okay to show off that Mexican and Spanish heritage. 1947, Allianza established the three-pillar program: morality, protection, and instruction. Under protection, it was civil rights, research, public relations, insurance, civil activities, employment, and opportunity. Morality covered the well-being of people of Mexican descent, including character, sanitation, sports, health, juvenile activity, recreation, citizenship, meaning to become a citizen, and what it was like, how to be a good citizen. And then the third pillar, instruction, focused on democracy, programs, adult education, rituals, scholarship, and school, especially scholarships to college, right? So these three pillars was a national program. And then each lodge would tailor it to their specific community for whatever they needed the most, right? The headquarters here in Tucson challenge segregation on a court level, Arizona Supreme Court, trying to strike down segregating Mexican American children in schools and classrooms, because they would have Mexican schools where only Mexican Americans would go, or they would have Mexican classrooms. And most often the excuse was, well, they don't speak English, so they have to be put together. Well, there's only one way you kind of learn English, right, is being mixed together, and learning that way is the best way. That the leaders of Allianza joined with LULAC and the American GI Forum to force the desegregation of schools across the Southwest, Los Angeles, Arizona, New Mexico to some extent, and Texas. These were huge civil rights organizations that we don't always hear about. We hear a lot about NAACP, right, and that the Brown versus Board of Education, but less is focused on the Mexican American civil rights civil rights movement. And this is where I come around, because I think it's absolutely fascinating, and you get to learn about new stuff here in the Southwest, and gives you a reason to come to the Southwest in the winter, because it's beautiful. Anyways, back to Allianza. They started a juvenile Allianza to get young people into Allianza so they would become members later, but also, again, right, to give children a place to learn, to be off the streets, because juvenile delinquency, especially in the 50s, right, very much a concern, especially with Mexican Americans, because they didn't want to be stereotyped. They already were, but they didn't want to give anybody an excuse, right, to point to Mexican Americans and saying, look at this. So juvenile programs were just key for Allianza, just like we saw with the American Legion posts, right, for basketball for boys. The Juvenile Allianza here in Tucson had a Saturday program. Every Saturday, they would have a program for anybody that wanted to come, Mexican Americans, Anglos, right? It didn't matter. And they would come in to their community center or wherever. It would kind of change sometimes. Where they would see wholesome movies, where they would listen to bands. The picture on the left is they would listen to mariachi bands, because they're trying to instill that Mexican or Spanish culture to them. Every year they would have, or every month they would have a birthday party to celebrate all of the children who had a party then, or had a birthday that month, and they would get a party, and most often a new bike, which was huge then. Part of the dues for Allianza would go to these juvenile Allianza programs. On the right here is the Allianza's Father's Day banquet, fostering that family. That idea of that Mexican Americans, very close-knit family, right? We're generational. Many generations live with each other, and that's part of the culture. And this was kind of showing it. Although this is a very middle-class representation of this, and Allianza was a very middle-class organization, but the idea that community is family, neighborhood, state, city, right? And then world, right? Community was very much individual, right? And every Allianza Lodge would tailor their Saturday programs or their specific juvenile programs to what they were being faced with there, because conditions in Los Angeles were completely different than here in Tucson, right? Which were completely different from Plano, Texas, right? So they really did tailor their activism. And veterans were absolutely the key to this. Allianza's membership grew exponentially with veterans and their families joining, because they wanted to be part of something larger, just like they were in the military. So they thought, what a best way to use our talents is organizing on a local level, using our veterans, right, to create these organizations in our community to exact change. And then it kind of blossomed across the United States. And by the time we got to the 1960s with the Chicano movement, they built upon what these World War II veterans did. And they didn't always get along, generational conflict, but the Mexican Americans of World War II kind of built this foundation of that our culture is important, and that our service was important, and what we do in the community is important for everybody. And that's kind of why I study this. I'm going to wrap up here in a second, so hopefully you all have some questions, because historians love to talk about their research, by the way. Never ask them how they're doing or what they research. My family absolutely knows not to have anybody ask me. Anyway, Mexican Americans in the Southwest absolutely helped win the war, just through sheer numbers of military men and women serving, but also on the home front. And everything that goes along with winning the war. Mexican Americans were absolutely a crucial part to that sometimes gets overlooked when we talk about World War II. Post-war America offered new opportunities for Mexican Americans, and they really were no longer willing to accept second-class citizenship. Just like Black soldiers during the Civil War, right? That once you pin that U.S. on their collar, they fought for something much larger for themselves. And fighting a war against fascism and tyranny changed them, and were just wanting to bring that change to the United States. There was also not one homogenous civil rights movement for Mexican Americans. As you know, this was a short explanation, and there are many more organizations that I could talk about and communities that I could talk about. The civil rights movement for Mexican Americans was broad, and it was diverse, and it made leaders popped up from small barrios, right? Hector Garcia from Corpus Christi, right? That these people, you know, came from small towns, small neighborhoods, and exacted change, right? And remember, Cesar Chavez was born here in Yuma, Arizona, and served in the military, and you know, was a huge civil rights leader. So his story is not unique, right? There are many, many more like that started in these communities. Veterans and their families organized locally for local conditions. What would best help their barrio? What would best help their community? Veterans joined, supported, organized, and pushed for change throughout. This last photo I picked for a reason, that Allianza welcomed Senator Kennedy, right? That Mexican Americans were kind of pushed out of the political process before World War II, but after World War II, Viva Kennedy, right? Very much had sprung up after the war, and mainly because of World War II veterans. They were not afraid of bureaucracy. They were not afraid of the government because they had served it, right? They had learned to work together. So they became so much more politically active, and veterans really led the charge on that. And were one of the major reasons that Kennedy was elected to be president. So I'm going to stop sharing here. Hopefully I can not screw this up again, right? There we go. I think that's it, yes?
That was it. Absolutely. But
All
thank
right.
you so much, Laura. That was incredible.
I feel like I was rushing. I was the whole PowerPoint thing. I was like, oh, I had such good slides, but you know, hopefully you all got to see them. I'll tell you what, I'll go, yeah.
Yeah, we appreciate you going back and showing. You definitely had some incredible slides there. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the Q&A. We have received a few questions from Zoom, but I do want to encourage you guys, if you have not already, place any questions you have within the Q&A feature on Zoom for Laura. And if you're watching on Facebook, place them as a comment underneath the video. So the first question that I have for you is, did Mexican Americans experience issues utilizing the GI Bill benefits similar to African Americans?
Oh, absolutely. And that's really what Hector Garcia, that's really what spurred him to become active. He was a doctor. He returned to South Texas, and he saw these veterans not being able to get dental care, health care from wounds received in battle in World War II. And, you know, he would be like, why don't you go to the VA? Why don't you use your GI Bill? And they were like, I don't know what you're talking about. There's also language issues, right? With these forms that they have to fill out that, you know, a lot of Mexican Americans, because of the poverty and limited education, didn't read English very well. So that's what kind of started him on this path until the Longoria affair happened. And then it kind of merged, right? Using GI Bills and exacting change and fighting segregation. Great question. Thank you.
So the next one is, you mentioned the specific Legion post in Arizona. How active are they today?
They are both active. The one in Phoenix is especially active. Their membership is much larger than the one in Tucson, but Phoenix is much bigger than Tucson also. They are, I had the pleasure to go and interview some of the veterans there several years ago. They were so welcoming. They were so active. They have a beautiful hall. And they remain active in the community, specifically now with either migrants or scholarships they still provide to get Mexican American children into universities, and clothes drives and well baby checks, everything, right? That they are still very active. Here in Tucson, it's a much smaller post. Their members are a little bit older. They haven't had as much luck in attracting younger veterans, especially from the war on terror. And but they are still. In fact, I went there on Sunday, and they were having a carne asada meal to raise money for clothing for local children, and I think it was for local children, clothing for local children. But they're still absolutely active, and they are amazing bunch of men and women, and I'm very proud of them.
Absolutely. So you talked about the discrimination that a lot of veterans faced, Mexican-American veterans faced when joining Legion Post or VFWs immediately after the war. Did they face that same discrimination with division reunions in the decades afterwards?
You know, it's interesting. For the most part, I've read and listened to probably hundreds of oral histories. And for the most part, I would say 90% that they may have experienced discrimination when they first got into the military and boot camp and everything. But then after combat, they were very close. And I think that just tells to, you know, what combat is, right? And how much you rely on that next person. Unlike African Americans, right, that were segregated specifically and that were limited to the jobs that they could do, right? Mexicans were integrated, and so that person, you know, depended on that Mexican American. And I have several oral histories that was like, you know, my dad always said you can't trust Mexicans, they'll stab you in the back, but you're amazing. Or, you know, or my favorite stories is Mexican parents were very good about sending chile to to their soldiers overseas, and you know, Anglos who had never been to the Southwest or had never seen, you know, salsa or tacos were like, what is this magic stuff? And that's how they kind of shared their culture and experiences and everything. So they're, for the most part, they didn't experience that if they were in combat. There are exceptions. There are, you know, there were stories of NCOs that absolutely were just horrible to them because they were Mexican and relegated them to the worst jobs and treated them incredibly unfairly. And you know, and some Anglos had never met Mexicans before and, you know, didn't know how to react or anything. So there were parts of that, but if they were in combat, it's the overall majority seemed to have had that brotherhood with the military.
Absolutely. So Rita asked, did it seem as if Mexican Americans were more predominant in one branch of the military over others, or was it pretty equally spread out?
No, absolutely. They were overrepresented in the U.S. Army. They served in frontline combat positions disproportionately to other minorities and to Anglos. And one of those reasons is prejudice on draft boards. Draft boards were local. They had the power. So if you had a draft board that was prejudiced or racist against Mexican Americans, they're not going to get deferments. They're not going to get Navy or Air Force. And for education deficiencies, because they didn't have the schooling to become navigators or, you know, bombardiers or whatever. They just didn't have that opportunity. My uncle was on Omaha, was U.S. Army because he quit school early to go work. But my Uncle Joe was a bombardier on a B-25 because he had more education. So he could pass the math part of that. So he got to serve in the Army Air Corps. But for the most part, they served in combat positions with the U.S. Army and enlisted. Hector Garcia was unusual that he was a officer. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, that really was a great question.
Yeah.
So looking more at a personal experience, Richard mentioned that his father served in the 84th Infantry Division and fought in the Battle of the Bulge, but he felt unwanted in his local VFW, so he never joined. And he was asking just what was the experience for Mexican American veterans in California?
Oh, in California, it was definitely, like, I don't know where in California, if it was Southern California specifically, was very segregated, right? And those signs that I showed early on were from California. So they had a strict segregation. And, you know, this is where the Zoot Suit riots, Pachuco riots, right? That the policemen and soldiers were just beating these Mexican Americans. So, you know, we like to think of California now as this egalitarian. Well, maybe some do, right? But absolutely segregation and Mexican Americans feeling unwanted. And actually, that's how we got the post here in Tucson, is that there was a very large McDermott post here in Tucson where Mexican Americans would go, but they felt out of place. They wouldn't speak up. They wouldn't do any of the activities because they kind of felt out of place. So that's when they decided, a few of them decided, you know what, let's create our own post, in the hopes of that Mexican Americans will join more and become more vocal and become more active in the post. So that's actually how it became about. At the same time, like with the Phoenix one, like Martina says, at first people thought, oh, they just want their own post to gamble and sell alcohol. That's all that they want. So they had to overcome those stereotypes. But California is fascinating. It's also where we get a lot of CSOs, community service organizations, organizing with Mexican Americans to challenge that segregation. And actually the first real challenge for ending segregation in schools was in California. So it's absolutely fascinating. And in my dissertation, I look at Los Angeles, Tucson, and El Paso for that specific reason, because they are so completely different when we talk about segregation and activism.
Yeah, so along those lines, staff on on Zoom was asking if these groups had also worked with civil rights organizations, or did they kind of work separately?
That's kind of once again, one of my main arguments is that activism is very local. For the most part, the Mexican American civil rights was completely separate from the African American civil rights. For one reason, African American civil rights was codified. Plessy versus Ferguson, black, white had to be separate. Even here in Arizona in the state constitution, it mandated that, right? For Mexican Americans, they were classified as white because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it's a long story, but they, even today, right, when I check my census box, it's white, but then I've checked Hispanic, or I check Mexican American. But so they couldn't be segregated because of that. They were segregated because of skin color, class, right, and language. So the Mexican American civil rights movement had to prove that they were being segregated. So they had to prove that, hey, you're saying that because we can't speak English that we're segregated. No, that's not true. These children speak English just fine. So they really couldn't. And Mexican Americans didn't fight saying segregation is wrong all over, like they could have with the African American civil rights movement. They said, no, you can't segregate Mexican Americans because we're white. And there was a conflict between them because of that. And later on, the groups, the higher ups, like at LULAC, recognized that we should be joining with African American civil rights groups, especially after after Brown versus Board of Education in '54. But it was still, there was still prejudice between the two groups. And in California, they worked a little bit more together in the '60s because of the neighborhoods were so multi-ethnic. You had Mexican Americans, Italian Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, all in this area. So there wasn't really that animosity as you see here in Arizona or in Texas. So yes and no, I guess, is the kind of the question for that. It's a really long answer for something very complicated.
So thinking about the '60s, Jim on Zoom asked, were Mexican Americans rewarded for their support of President Kennedy after he won the 1960 election?
Oh, there's a great new book by one of my favorite historians, Jerry Cadava, the Hispanic Republican, that really goes into this. This has been the thing, right? Like everybody says, hey, Latinos, voted for Republicans 30%. How is that possible, kind of thing? Because people lump Latinos all together. And again, they're very separate, very distinct and different goals. One of the main things that Hispanics as a whole have argued is that we have backed a candidate, and once that candidate is elected, that they are forgotten. So, Kennedy got a lot of heat from local Mexican American leaders that there were not more Hispanics appointed to federal offices. Maybe once in a while you'd get an ambassador kind of thing, but nothing in the cabinet kind of thing. And this has been going on ad nauseum even today, right? Of courting that Latino vote is very prized, but that Mexican Americans and Latinos do not get represented, get their gold at the end of the thing there. So Yes and no. I mean, Senator Kennedy was definitely more liberal, but let's face it, he didn't end segregation, right? It was Lyndon Johnson, who was much more uh, beneficial to Mexican Americans because of his growing up in South Texas and teaching at a Mexican American segregated school. So his Voting Rights Act, right, and his Civil Rights Act did more than Kennedy had done.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit more to the research side of things, the questions that your family is not allowed to ask you.
All right.
So Rosalinda and David both asked questions related to your research. I'm going to combine them.
Okay.
How did the 70s fire impact the records for the US Army members? And then also, what was the most interesting document that you came across during the research?
Oh, I love those questions. One, yeah, the fire, and that affected my dad. My dad is a Korean War veteran, and trying to get VA stuff for him was a nightmare. To some extent, it does, right? That fire did did hinder a lot, but it is the National Archives carries a lot of information, right, on specific stuff like that and oral histories, and that is carried out by local museums, like where I work at the Historical Society, right, and up at Arizona State University, where local historical societies take those oral histories and save those oral histories and those documents and everything. Federal records, for sure, right? Those are hard, but usually I can get enlistment records, ancestry.com, fold 3, right? Or I can make public requests through the National Archives. And once in a while, I will run into a problem, but my research doesn't really look at, I'm not a typical military historian where this person served in this unit and fought in this battle, in this battle, in this battle. That might be a little bit harder, right, for those records. I look more at where they came from, why they joined the military, where they did serve, right? Like I want to know, did they serve combat and where they served it, were they injured, and then their active back. So my research is not incredibly affected by that. It's been much more affected by COVID, right? Because those archives have been closed. But yes, it's still a nightmare if you can't find a military record and it was in St. Louis. Yeah, you're like, oh man. My favorite thing, there are a couple of things, I guess. My favorite story is I found an oral history from a Mexican American soldier who was in Texas, and he and his family were repatriated to Mexico in the 1930s. I think it was 1937, back to Mexico. He was a U.S. citizen. He and his family had been here. He'd been here forever, right? And his family had been here. They had really no ties to Mexico, but they were forced to go back, so they lived there. And the US government actually found him and drafted him in Texas. And he writes, and he was like, well, I got my draft notice, so I'm going to be crossing the border illegally so that I can go, do my entry into the US military. And he went back across the border and enlisted and fought in combat for the US. And I just think, what an amazing story. I don't know if I would have been that good of a person. I really have I would love to have talked to him. His oral history was not very in depth, and man, I would love to know more about that. So I'll give my one spiel here. Please talk to your parents, your grandparents, take your documents, take whatever you have, record them, save them, take them to a museum, a historical society, the World War II museum, please, because people, like my uncles, didn't think anything about their service. And, I thank God I took their oral histories, and thank God I saved what I could from them. But I am missing so much. And a lot of people, underrepresented people, don't think their stories are important. And let me tell you, from a historian and from a personal view, they are. Please save everything. That's my spiel.
Ditto. So we have one final question for tonight, and it is from Fernando on Zoom. He would like to know any recommendations that you have to learn more about your topic and your research.
Oh man, I have so many books, right? Like I have, when you get a PhD, that's literally all you do for like 4 years. So I'm wondering if, I don't know if you all allow it, but I can make up a reading list and send it to you, and then you could post it on Facebook or send it out when you send out the video recording or anything. But Mexican American and Civil Rights is one of my favorite books by Del Castillo. And he was really one of the first ones to write about it. And Maggie Rivas Rodriguez at the University of Texas started the Voices program, VOCES, and it's the largest oral history repository for Mexican American soldiers, and it's from World War II onward. And she has written, I want to say 4 books on Latinos in the military, primarily Mexican Americans in the military. And they have on their website, you can read their oral histories also and pick by region or whatever. I would think start there, but I can also make a list for anybody and share it with the World War II Museum for them to get it out if that's possible for you all.
Absolutely, we can definitely do that.
Awesome.
We can send it to the Zoom participants and put it in the comments on Facebook for folks to reference later.
Fantastic.
So, perfect. Well, Laura, this was wonderful. We truly appreciate your time, your research, and as a lot of folks have been putting in the Q&A, they also really appreciated this and saw your passion for your research as well.
It's good because I bore my family to death, including my mom. So she was like, enough with your uncles, right? Enough with your stuff. So.
Absolutely. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight. We appreciate you guys checking out our program for Hispanic Heritage Month. We also want to encourage you, if you enjoyed tonight's program, to go to our Facebook page and to our website and learn more about our upcoming programs. We have an upcoming international conference, different commemorative programs for the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, Veterans Day, etc., that are coming up. So for now, take care, and we look forward to seeing you guys next time here at the
Thank you all.
World War II Museum.
Thank you so much. Take care. Be safe.